Good evening, and welcome. Tonight, we will leave behind the noise and speed of the modern world and travel back more than 1,000 years into the past. Our journey takes us to the northern lands of Scandinavia, where mountains rise above deep fjords, where forests stretch across vast landscapes, and where winter arrives with a quiet but powerful presence. As you settle in and relax, imagine a cold wind moving gently across a snowy hillside. The sky above is pale and gray. The sun hangs low on the horizon, providing only a few hours of daylight before darkness slowly returns. The air is crisp and still, and the distant sound of waves echoes through a frozen fjord. This was the world of the Vikings. Today, many people imagine Vikings as fearless warriors sailing across stormy seas in longships. They picture great battles, shining weapons, and daring adventures. While such events certainly existed, they represented only a small part of everyday Viking life. Most Vikings were not warriors at all. The majority of people living in Viking Age Scandinavia were farmers, fishermen, craftsmen, and traders. They spent much of their lives working the land, raising animals, building homes, and caring for their families. Their greatest challenge was often not warfare, but survival. Every year, as autumn came to an end, a familiar concern filled Viking communities. Winter was approaching. Unlike modern societies, Viking villages had no electric heating, no supermarkets, and no rapid transportation systems. Once snow covered the ground and icy winds swept across the landscape, obtaining food and supplies became far more difficult. The arrival of winter demanded careful preparation. A mistake made during summer could become a serious problem months later. A poor harvest, insufficient firewood, or spoiled food could place an entire household at risk. Survival depended upon planning, hard work, and cooperation. The people of Scandinavia understood this reality very well. Long before the first snowfall arrived, families began preparing for the cold season ahead. Crops were harvested, animals were cared for, and food was stored away. Every task served a purpose. Every resource mattered. As winter slowly settled across the land, daily life changed. Fields that had once been green became hidden beneath blankets of snow. Rivers froze. Travel became more difficult. Fishing and farming activities decreased. Families spent more time indoors, gathered around the warmth of a central fire. Inside their homes, life continued. Children learned skills from their parents. Craftsmen repaired tools. Women spun wool into thread and created warm clothing. Elders shared stories passed down through generations. The long winter nights became a time for work, conversation, and storytelling. Outside, darkness often arrived early. In some northern regions, daylight lasted only a few short hours. The sun rose late and disappeared quickly. For weeks at a time, the world seemed wrapped in shadows. Yet the Vikings adapted. They had learned to live with the rhythm of the seasons. Winter was not an unexpected disaster. It was a familiar visitor that arrived every year. Although harsh and demanding, it was simply a part of life. Many Viking settlements were located near fjords and coastlines. These areas provided important resources throughout the year. Fish could be caught from the sea, while forests supplied timber for building homes and ships. Even so, winter brought uncertainty. Storms could damage buildings. Heavy snow could isolate communities. Food supplies had to last until spring. The survival of an entire household often depended upon decisions made months earlier. Imagine standing outside a Viking longhouse on a winter evening. Snowflakes drift slowly through the air. A faint glow shines from the windows. Smoke rises from an opening in the roof and disappears into the dark sky. Inside, families gather near the hearth fire, protected from the cold winds outside. The warmth of the fire fills the room. Wood crackles softly. The smell of cooked food drifts through the air. Someone repairs a tool by firelight. Others weave cloth or prepare meals. Children listen carefully as an elder begins to tell a story about distant voyages, ancient heroes, or powerful gods. For a moment, the hardships of winter seem far away. This simple scene captures an important truth about Viking survival. Their strength did not come only from physical endurance. It came from preparation. It came from community. And it came from knowledge passed from one generation to the next. Throughout this journey, we will explore how Viking families prepared for winter, how they stored food, how they stayed warm, and how they endured months of darkness and cold. We will discover the practical skills that allowed ordinary people to survive in one of Europe's most demanding environments. And we will learn that behind the famous image of the Viking warrior stood countless families whose daily efforts made survival possible. So, as the winter wind blows gently across the frozen landscape, and as darkness settles over the fjords of Scandinavia, let us begin our exploration of life during a Viking winter. Our story starts with the land itself. Because before we can understand how the Vikings survived winter, we must first understand the remarkable world in which they lived. As our journey continues, let us take a closer look at the land that the Vikings called home. To understand how Viking families survived the long winters of the north, we must first understand the geography that shaped every aspect of their lives. The landscapes of Scandinavia were beautiful, but they could also be demanding and unforgiving. Mountains, forests, rocky coastlines, and cold seas influenced where people lived, what they ate, and how they prepared for the changing seasons. More than 1,000 years ago, the Viking world was centered in the regions we now know as Norway, Sweden, and Denmark. Although these lands shared many cultural traditions, their geography varied greatly from one area to another. Let us begin with Norway. Norway was perhaps the most dramatic of the Viking lands. Much of the country was covered by steep mountains that rose sharply from the sea. Along the coastline, enormous fjords stretched deep into the landscape. These narrow waterways, carved by ancient glaciers thousands of years earlier, created natural harbors and connected distant communities. For Viking families living near these fjords, the sea was an essential part of daily life. The ocean provided fish, transportation, might otherwise have been separated by rugged terrain. In many places, traveling by boat was far easier than traveling across mountains. Yet the same waters that provided opportunity could also bring danger. Winter storms swept across the North Atlantic with great force. Powerful winds and rough seas could make travel difficult or impossible. During the coldest months, families often remained close to home, relying on supplies they had gathered throughout the year. To the east lay Sweden. Unlike the steep coastal landscapes of Norway, much of Sweden consisted of vast forests, rolling hills, lakes, and fertile valleys. These forests stretched for hundreds of miles and contained valuable resources such as timber, game animals, and firewood. For Viking communities, forests were more than just wilderness. They provided the wood needed to build homes, tools, furniture, and ships. Every winter required enormous quantities of firewood, and gathering enough fuel was one of the most important tasks of the year. The forests also supported hunting. Elk, deer, wild boar, and smaller animals could provide meat, hides, and bones. During difficult winters, these resources became even more valuable. Further south was Denmark. Compared to Norway and Sweden, Denmark was generally flatter and more suitable for farming. Its fertile soil allowed Viking farmers to grow crops more easily than many of their northern neighbors. Fields of barley, rye, and oats covered parts of the Danish countryside. These crops formed the foundation of many Viking diets. Successful harvests helped communities build reserves that could sustain them through the winter months. Even here, however, winter remained a serious challenge. Cold weather could damage crops. Storms could affect livestock. Food shortages were always a possibility if preparations were insufficient. Across Scandinavia, the climate varied depending on location. Southern regions experienced somewhat milder winters, while northern areas faced much harsher conditions. In the far north, winter brought extremely short days and long periods of darkness. Imagine waking in a world where sunlight lasted only a few hours. The sun might rise briefly above the horizon before disappearing once again. The landscape would remain covered in snow and ice, while long nights stretched across the weeks. For people living in these regions, winter was not simply a season. It was a way of life. The changing seasons dictated nearly every activity. Spring brought planting and new growth. Summer provided long days for farming, fishing, and construction. Autumn became a season of preparation and harvest. And winter demanded patience, caution, and endurance. One of the most important geographical features of Scandinavia was its abundance of water. Thousands of lakes, rivers, and coastal waterways connected communities across great distances. During warmer months, these routes allowed trade and communication to flourish. But winter changed everything. Rivers could freeze. Snow could block pathways. Ice could transform familiar landscapes into entirely different environments. Travel became slower and more dangerous. A journey that might take a single day in summer could require several days during winter. Harsh weather often forced travelers to wait for better conditions. As a result, many Viking communities became more isolated during the coldest months. Families relied heavily on local resources and on the support of their neighbors. The geography of Scandinavia also influenced the design of Viking settlements. Most villages were built near sources of water. Access to rivers, lakes, or coastlines made transportation easier and provided food through fishing. Homes were often positioned in sheltered locations where natural features offered some protection from strong winds. Hills, forests, and valleys helped reduce exposure to severe weather. Even the placement of a longhouse could affect a family's ability to survive winter. A well-chosen location could provide warmth, safety, and access to essential resources. A poor location could expose a household to storms, flooding, or freezing winds. Over generations, Viking communities learned how to live in harmony with their environment. They observed weather patterns. They studied the land. They understood which areas offered fertile soil and which regions were best suited for grazing animals. This knowledge was passed from parents to children and became an essential part of survival. The Vikings did not attempt to conquer nature. Instead, they adapted to it. They recognized that the land itself was both a provider and a challenge. The forests supplied fuel, the sea provided food, the fields produced crops, yet each of these gifts required effort, skill, and respect. As winter approached each year, the geography of Scandinavia reminded people of an important lesson. Survival depended upon preparation. The mountains, forests, and fjords would not become less harsh simply because winter had arrived. Families had to be ready before the first snow began to fall. And so, throughout the warmer months, Viking households worked tirelessly to prepare for the season ahead. Because in these northern lands, winter was never far away. In the next part of our journey, we will explore how Viking families spent the summer and autumn months preparing for the cold season, gathering supplies and making careful plans to ensure they could survive the long winter ahead. As the warm days of summer slowly passed across the Viking world, few people spent much time thinking about comfort or relaxation. The season was simply too important. Every hour of sunlight, every successful harvest, and every task completed before autumn would play a role in determining whether a family could survive the winter ahead. For Viking communities, preparation was not an occasional activity. It was a way of life. Long before the first snowflakes drifted from the sky, families were already working to secure the resources they would need during the cold months. They understood that winter could last for many weeks, sometimes even longer than expected. Once deep snow covered the fields and icy winds swept across the landscape, obtaining food and fuel became far more difficult. The work of winter survival began in spring. As the ground softened after months of cold weather, farmers returned to their fields. Wooden plows were used to prepare the soil, and seeds were carefully planted. Barley was among the most important crops grown by Viking farmers. This hardy grain could survive in northern climates better than many other plants. It was used to make bread, porridge, and ale, providing a reliable source of nutrition throughout the year. Oats and rye were also common in many regions. These crops were valuable because they could be stored for long periods if kept dry and protected from pests. A successful harvest meant security. A poor harvest created uncertainty. Throughout the summer months, families devoted countless hours to caring for their fields. Children often helped with simple tasks, while adults worked from sunrise until sunset. The long summer days of Scandinavia provided precious time for farming. In some northern areas, daylight lasted late into the evening, allowing work to continue for many hours. Yet crops were only one part of winter preparation. Animals also required careful attention. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs played essential roles in Viking households. They provided milk, meat, wool, hides, and labor. During summer, livestock grazed in open pastures, feeding on fresh vegetation. But everyone knew that winter would eventually arrive. As a result, families spent considerable effort gathering hay and other fodder. Large quantities of grass were cut, dried, and stored for later use. Without enough feed, animals might not survive until spring. And losing livestock could have serious consequences for an entire household. A healthy cow could provide milk for months. A flock of sheep supplied wool for warm clothing. Every animal represented both wealth and survival. Another critical task was gathering firewood. Today, many people can heat their homes with the push of a button. Viking families had no such convenience. Their warmth depended entirely on wood. Throughout summer and autumn, men, women, and older children collected timber from nearby forests. Trees were cut down, branches removed, and logs split into manageable pieces. The work was physically demanding, yet everyone understood its importance. A long winter could consume enormous amounts of firewood. The hearth fire provided heat, light, and a place for cooking meals. Without sufficient fuel, surviving the cold months would become far more difficult. As autumn approached, activity intensified. The harvest season arrived. Fields that had been carefully tended throughout the year now needed to be gathered before bad weather could damage the crops. Entire families participated. Barley, oats, and rye were harvested and stored. Vegetables were collected from gardens. Wild berries, nuts, and herbs were gathered from forests and meadows. Nothing useful was wasted. Every resource had value. Food preservation became one of the most important responsibilities of the season. Fresh food could spoil quickly. To ensure supplies lasted through winter, Viking families used several preservation techniques. Fish were dried in the open air. Meat was smoked over fires. Some foods were salted. Others were stored in cool locations where they could remain edible for months. The sight of drying fish hanging from wooden racks became common in many coastal settlements. The cold northern climate often helped preserve food naturally, making these methods especially effective. Fishing itself was a major part of winter preparation. During favorable weather, fishermen ventured onto lakes, rivers, and coastal waters to catch large quantities of fish. Cod, herring, and other species were valuable sources of protein. Once preserved, these fish could sustain families long after fresh food became scarce. For coastal communities, successful fishing seasons were just as important as successful harvests. The sea often provided a safety net when crops failed. As autumn deepened, Viking households also turned their attention to repairing buildings and tools. Roofs were inspected, walls were strengthened, gaps that might allow cold air to enter were sealed. Tools damaged during summer work were repaired before winter arrived. Axes, knives, farming equipment, and household items all needed maintenance. A broken tool during winter could be difficult to replace. Preparation meant reducing future problems whenever possible. In many villages, these tasks created a strong sense of community. Neighbors often assisted one another during large projects. Families shared knowledge, labor, and resources. Survival was rarely an individual effort. The success of a community often depended upon cooperation. If one household suffered a poor harvest, nearby families might provide assistance. Likewise, those receiving help understood they might someday return the favor. As the leaves changed color and temperatures gradually declined, a feeling of urgency spread across the Viking world. The signs of approaching winter became impossible to ignore. Birds migrated south. Days grew shorter. Morning frost appeared on fields and rooftops. The landscape itself seemed to be preparing for the season ahead. Inside their homes, families counted supplies and reviewed their preparations. Did they have enough grain? Enough dried fish? Enough firewood? Enough hay for the animals? These questions carried tremendous importance. The answers could determine whether a household faced winter with confidence or concern. For Viking families, survival was not based on luck. It depended upon months of careful planning and hard work. Every harvested field, every stacked log, and every preserved fish represented another step toward safety. By the time the first snow finally arrived, the most important preparations needed to be complete. Because once winter settled across Scandinavia, opportunities for gathering resources became increasingly limited. The season of preparation would come to an end. The season of endurance would begin. And in the next part of our journey, we will witness the final days before snowfall, when Viking communities made their last preparations before the long winter truly arrived. As autumn slowly drew to a close, a quiet transformation began to take place across the Viking world. The bright greens of summer had long since faded. Leaves turned shades of gold, red, and brown before falling gently to the ground. The air became cooler with each passing day, and the sun seemed to linger for shorter periods in the sky. For Viking families, these changes were more than signs of a new season. They were reminders. Winter was coming. And now, in the final weeks before the first heavy snowfall, every household entered a period of intense preparation. The major harvests had already been gathered. Much of the firewood had been cut and stacked. Food stores had been filled as best they could. Yet many important tasks still remained. These final preparations could make the difference between a comfortable winter and a difficult one. Each morning, villagers stepped outside and carefully observed the weather. They watched the clouds. They noticed the changing winds. They paid attention to the behavior of animals. Without modern forecasts, experience became their guide. Generations of observation had taught people to recognize the subtle signs of approaching winter. An early frost covering the fields. Migrating birds flying south. The first thin layer of ice appearing on ponds and streams. Nature often gave warning before winter arrived in full force. One of the most important tasks during these final days involved livestock. Throughout much of the year, animals had grazed freely in open pastures. They wandered across fields and hillsides, feeding on grass and other vegetation. But now the growing season was ending. Soon, snow would cover the land. Families began bringing animals closer to home. Sheep, goats, and cattle were gradually moved into sheltered areas where they could be protected from severe weather. In many Viking settlements, animals were housed within or near the longhouse itself. To modern people, this arrangement might seem unusual, but it served several practical purposes. Animals provided warmth. Their body heat helped raise temperatures inside the building during the coldest nights. At the same time, keeping livestock nearby protected them from predators and harsh weather. The sounds of animals became a familiar part of winter life. The lowing of cattle, the bleating of sheep, the gentle movements of creatures settling down for the night. These sounds often filled the longhouse alongside the crackling of the hearth fire. Meanwhile, attention turned toward the buildings themselves. Winter storms could be fierce. Strong winds swept across the fjords and forests, testing the strength of every roof and wall. Families carefully inspected their homes. Loose boards were secured, thatch roofs were repaired, openings that allowed cold drafts inside were blocked. Every effort was made to keep warmth from escaping. The Viking longhouse had evolved over centuries to meet the challenges of northern climates. Its thick wooden walls provided protection from wind and snow. Its long shape helped maximize interior space. Its central hearth served as both a source of heat and a gathering place. Yet even the strongest longhouse required maintenance. No family wanted to discover a leaking roof during a winter storm. Firewood stacks also received careful attention. Months of cutting, splitting, and hauling wood had produced large piles of fuel. Now these supplies needed protection. Wood was arranged in neat stacks and covered whenever possible. Keeping firewood dry was essential. Wet wood produced less heat and created more smoke. A well-maintained woodpile represented security. Each stack contained countless hours of labor and offered reassurance against the cold months ahead. Inside the home, women and men worked together to organize food stores. Barrels of preserved fish were checked. Sacks of grain were inspected. Smoked meats hung from rafters or rested in storage areas. Every item had to be protected from moisture, rodents, and spoilage. Food represented survival. There was no room for carelessness. Families often counted their supplies repeatedly. Would the food last until spring? Had enough been stored? These questions occupied many minds as winter approached. The shorter days added a sense of urgency. With fewer hours of daylight available, outdoor work became increasingly difficult. Shadows stretched across the landscape long before evening arrived. The sun remained low in the sky, casting a soft golden light over fields and forests. Sometimes a thin layer of frost appeared before sunrise. At first, it melted during the day. But as temperatures continued to fall, the frost lingered longer and longer. Children often woke to discover sparkling white crystals covering the ground. To them, these early signs of winter could feel magical. To adults, they were reminders that time was running short. The forests also grew quieter. Many birds had already begun their migrations. Some animals prepared for hibernation. Others became more difficult to find. The natural world seemed to be settling into a slower rhythm. Even the sea changed. Coastal winds became colder. Storms appeared more frequently. Fishing remained important, but journeys onto open water carried greater risks. Experienced sailors knew when conditions were becoming dangerous. The ocean that had provided food and trade throughout the year could quickly become unpredictable. As a result, many communities gradually reduced long-distance travel. Attention shifted inward. Families focused more on home, village, and immediate surroundings. The pace of life changed. There was less movement across the landscape and more activity within homes and workshops. Evenings became longer. After sunset, families gathered around the hearth fire. The warm glow of flames illuminated faces while darkness settled outside. Conversations filled the room. Stories were shared. Plans for winter were discussed. For many people, these evenings offered a sense of comfort. The hard work of preparation was nearly complete. Soon there would be little left to do except wait. And then, one morning, it would happen. A family would wake to discover that the world outside had changed. The fields would be white. The rooftops would be covered. The paths between buildings would disappear beneath fresh snow. Winter would have arrived. For Viking communities, this moment marked the beginning of a new phase of life. The season of preparation was over. Now came the challenge of enduring the cold, darkness, and uncertainty of the months ahead. Yet there was also confidence. Families had worked for months to reach this point. They had harvested crops, stored food, gathered fuel, repaired homes, and protected their animals. They were as ready as they could be. And as the first snowflakes drifted quietly from the gray northern sky, life in the Viking world moved indoors, into the warmth and shelter of the longhouse. In the next part of our journey, we will step inside one of these remarkable buildings and discover how Viking families lived together during the long winter months. As the first heavy snows settled across the Scandinavian landscape, the world outside began to grow quieter. Fields disappeared beneath blankets of white. Forest paths became difficult to follow. The cold wind sweeping across the fjords encouraged people to spend less time outdoors and more time within the safety of their homes. For Viking families, winter life revolved around one central place: the longhouse. More than simply a building, the longhouse was the heart of daily life. It provided warmth, shelter, security, and a gathering place for entire families. During the harsh winter months, people could spend many hours, and sometimes entire days, within its walls. To understand how Vikings survived long winters, we must first step inside one of these remarkable structures. Imagine approaching a longhouse on a cold winter evening. Snow crunches softly beneath your feet. The air is sharp and cold. Above, the sky is already dark, even though the day feels as if it has barely begun. Ahead, a warm glow shines faintly through small openings in the walls. Smoke rises from the roof and disappears into the night. As you move closer, you can hear distant sounds from inside. The murmur of conversation, the crackling of a fire, the occasional movement of animals. You push open the heavy wooden door and step inside. Immediately, the warmth surrounds you. The contrast between the freezing air outside and the heated interior is comforting. The longhouse is larger than many modern people might expect. Some structures stretched over 20 or even 30 meters in length. Wealthier families could own even larger homes. The building itself is long and rectangular, with a roof that slopes downward on both sides. Thick wooden beams support the structure. Walls made from timber, planks, or turf help protect against the winter weather. The roof, often covered with thatch or sod, provides additional insulation against the cold. The interior is dimly lit. There are no electric lights. Instead, illumination comes from the central hearth fire and a few oil lamps or candles. The dancing flames create moving shadows along the walls, giving the room a calm and peaceful atmosphere. At the center of the longhouse lies the hearth. This fire is the heart of the home. Throughout winter, it burns almost constantly. Its warmth helps keep the interior comfortable. Its light allows people to work after sunset. Its heat cooks meals and dries damp clothing. Around this fire, daily life unfolds. Benches line the walls. Wooden chests store valuable possessions. Tools hang from beams. Bundles of wool, clothing, and household items occupy various corners of the room. Everything has a purpose. Space is used carefully. Unlike many modern homes, privacy is limited. Large families often live together under a single roof. Parents, children, grandparents, and sometimes other relatives share the same living area. Everyone becomes accustomed to living closely with one another. During winter, this closeness serves an important purpose. Shared body heat helps keep the space warmer. Resources can be managed more efficiently. And family members can support one another through the challenges of the season. The sounds inside the longhouse become familiar and comforting. The fire crackles steadily. Wood occasionally shifts in the flames. Someone speaks quietly nearby. A child laughs. A spindle turns as wool is spun into thread. The atmosphere is busy but peaceful. Animals are also part of this environment. In many Viking households, livestock were kept inside or in attached sections of the building during severe weather. Sheep, goats, and cattle contributed warmth while remaining protected from the elements. To modern visitors, the presence of animals indoors might seem unusual. Yet, for Viking families, it was entirely practical. Animals represented wealth and survival. Protecting them was essential. The smell of the longhouse reflected this shared living arrangement. Smoke from the hearth mixed with the scents of wood, wool, cooked food, and livestock. Although the air could sometimes become smoky, people adapted to these conditions from an early age. Throughout the day, family members remained occupied with important tasks. Winter was not a season of idleness. Clothing needed repair. Tools required maintenance. Food had to be prepared. Wool was spun and woven into warm garments. Leather goods were mended. Fishing nets were repaired in anticipation of future seasons. Even during the coldest months, work continued. The longhouse functioned as a workshop as much as a home. Children learned valuable skills by observing adults. Boys and girls watched parents and grandparents perform daily tasks. Knowledge passed naturally from one generation to the next. A child might learn how to weave, carve wood, repair tools, or care for animals simply by participating in everyday life. These lessons were essential. One day, they too would be responsible for helping a household survive winter. Meals provided important moments of togetherness. Family members gathered near the hearth to share food prepared from carefully preserved supplies. Stews simmered slowly over the fire. Bread baked on hot stones. Dried fish and smoked meats appeared regularly on the table. The food might not always be luxurious, but it provided nourishment and comfort. During the darkest evenings, storytelling became one of the most valued activities. Without books, television, or modern entertainment, stories played an important role in Viking culture. Elders shared tales of heroes, voyages, legendary kings, and powerful gods. Children listened closely. Adults enjoyed stories they had heard many times before. These narratives preserved history, taught lessons, and strengthened community bonds. Outside, winter storms might rage across the landscape. Snow could pile high against the walls. Winds could howl through the darkness. Yet inside the longhouse, families remained together. The building served as a barrier between the harsh world outside and the warmth of home. For many months each year, the longhouse became a small world of its own. A place of work, a place of learning, a place of storytelling, a place of survival. It was here, within these wooden walls, that Viking families endured the long northern winters. And at the center of everything stood the hearth fire, providing the warmth and light upon which daily life depended. In the next part of our journey, we will gather around that fire and discover how the hearth became one of the most important elements of winter survival in the Viking world. As winter settled firmly across the Viking world, and snow covered the fields and forests of Scandinavia, one feature of the longhouse became more important than any other. The hearth fire. Day after day, night after night, it burned at the center of the home. Its flames provided warmth against the cold. Its light pushed back the darkness. Its heat cooked meals and dried wet clothing. For Viking families enduring long winters, the hearth was far more than a simple fire. It was the heart of daily life. Imagine waking before sunrise on a winter morning. Outside, the world remains silent and dark. The wind moves gently across the snow-covered landscape. Frost covers the windows, and the cold air presses against the walls of the longhouse. Inside, however, a faint orange glow still flickers among the ashes of last night's fire. Someone rises quietly. Perhaps it is a parent, a grandparent, or another member of the household. Their first task of the day is not farming, fishing, or repairing tools. It is tending the fire. The remaining embers are carefully stirred. Small pieces of dry wood are added. A few moments later, tiny flames begin to appear. Gradually, the fire comes back to life. The warmth slowly spreads through the room. For centuries, this simple routine was repeated countless times across Viking settlements. Keeping the hearth alive was a daily responsibility. Allowing it to go out completely could create significant problems. Starting a new fire was possible, of course, but it required effort and valuable time. Whenever possible, families preferred to maintain a continuous source of embers. This made it easier to rekindle the flames each morning. The location of the hearth was carefully chosen. Most Viking longhouses placed the fire near the center of the building. This allowed heat to spread more evenly throughout the interior. Above the fire, a small opening in the roof helped smoke escape. Even so, some smoke remained inside. To modern visitors, the air might have seemed smoky or uncomfortable. But Viking families were accustomed to it. In fact, the smoke offered certain advantages. It helped preserve wooden structures. It discouraged insects, and it contributed to the drying and preservation of food. The fire itself required constant attention. Wood needed to be added regularly. Ashes had to be managed. The flames had to be monitored to ensure safety. This responsibility was shared among members of the household. Everyone understood the importance of maintaining the hearth. During winter, firewood became one of the most valuable resources a family possessed. Months earlier, during summer and autumn, enormous effort had gone into collecting and storing enough fuel. Trees had been cut, logs had been split, wood had been stacked carefully to remain dry. Now, during the darkest months of the year, those preparations began to pay off. Each log placed upon the fire represented labor completed long ago. Without sufficient firewood, winter could become dangerous. Warmth was not a luxury. It was a necessity. The hearth also served as the center of cooking activities. Most meals were prepared over open flames or hot coals. Iron pots hung above the fire. Stews simmered slowly for hours. Fish, meat, and vegetables were cooked using simple but effective methods. The smell of food often filled the longhouse. A pot of stew bubbling gently over the fire provided not only nourishment but also comfort. The warm aroma reminded everyone that supplies remained available and that preparations had been successful. Throughout the day, family members naturally gathered around the hearth. The warmest part of the longhouse was usually closest to the fire. People repaired clothing, carved wood, spun wool, and completed other tasks while sitting. Nearby, children often played close to the warmth. Elders shared stories and advice. Conversations unfolded naturally around the flames. In many ways, the hearth acted as the social center of the household. It brought people together. Winter evenings were especially important. After sunset, darkness arrived quickly. Outside, snow reflected faint moonlight. Inside, the fire became the primary source of illumination. Its flickering glow transformed the longhouse into a peaceful and welcoming space. The shadows danced across wooden beams. The sounds of crackling logs filled the room. Family members settled into familiar routines. Some worked quietly, others listened to stories. Many simply enjoyed the warmth. The fire created a sense of security. No matter how fierce the weather became outside, the hearth reminded everyone that they were protected. Storms occasionally swept across Scandinavia during winter. Powerful winds rattled doors and walls. Snow accumulated in deep drifts. Travel became impossible, yet inside the longhouse, the steady glow of the hearth remained constant. It symbolized stability during uncertain times. The psychological importance of the fire should not be underestimated. Long winters could feel endless. Days were short. Darkness arrived early. Isolation affected many communities. The warmth and light of the hearth helped maintain morale. It provided a focal point around which family life continued. The fire also played a role in hospitality. Visitors arriving during winter journeys were often welcomed near the hearth. Offering warmth and food to guests was an important cultural tradition. A traveler who had spent hours in freezing conditions would immediately appreciate the comfort of a well-maintained fire. Sharing that warmth strengthened social bonds and reinforced community values. As winter progressed, the daily cycle continued. Morning fires were rekindled, meals were cooked, stories were told, work was completed, and every evening, families gathered once again around the flames. The hearth connected generations. Children learned from adults. Skills were passed down. Memories were shared. Knowledge accumulated over centuries continued to survive because families spent so much time together around the fire. In many respects, the hearth was the silent hero of the Viking winter. It asked for constant attention. It consumed valuable resources, yet it gave back far more than it took. Warmth, light, food, comfort, community. Without the hearth, surviving the long Scandinavian winter would have been nearly impossible. And as another cold evening settles over the snow-covered landscape, the fire continues to burn steadily at the center of the longhouse. Its glow illuminates faces young and old. Its warmth fills the room. And its presence reminds everyone that, for now at least, they are safe from the cold world beyond the walls. In the next part of our journey, we will discover exactly what Viking families ate during these long winter months and how preserved food supplies helped them survive until the return of spring. As the hearth fire burned quietly at the center of the longhouse, another important question occupied the minds of Viking families throughout the winter. What would they eat? For modern people, obtaining food is often a simple task. A visit to a nearby shop or market can provide fresh ingredients from around the world at almost any time of year. The Vikings lived in a very different world. During the winter months, snow covered the fields. Rivers froze. Travel became more difficult. Fresh crops were no longer growing, and opportunities for gathering food from nature became limited. Everything depended on preparation. The meals enjoyed during winter were often the result of work completed many months earlier. Every loaf of bread, every bowl of stew, and every piece of preserved fish represented careful planning and hard work. Imagine a winter morning inside a Viking longhouse. Outside, darkness still covers the landscape. Inside, the hearth fire crackles softly as someone begins preparing the first meal of the day. There are no refrigerators, no canned foods, no imported ingredients. Instead, the family relies on supplies stored during the warmer seasons. One of the most important foods in the Viking diet was grain. Barley, rye, and oats were grown throughout much of Scandinavia. These grains could be stored for long periods if kept dry and protected from pests. Barley was especially valuable. It was used to make bread, porridge, and ale. A simple bowl of warm barley porridge provided energy and comfort during cold winter mornings. For many families, porridge was a common meal because it was filling, nutritious, and relatively easy to prepare. Bread was another important staple. Unlike the soft loaves found in many modern bakeries, Viking bread was often dense and coarse. It was made using available grains and baked over hot stones or near the hearth fire. Although simple, bread provided valuable calories during a season when energy was essential. Fish played an equally important role in winter survival. The sea had always been one of Scandinavia's greatest resources. During the warmer months, fishermen caught large quantities of fish and preserved them for future use. Cod was especially important in many coastal communities. After being caught, the fish could be cleaned and hung outside to dry in the cool northern air. Once dried, it became remarkably durable. Some preserved fish could last for many months. Throughout winter, families regularly consumed these supplies. Dried fish might be softened in water before cooking or added directly to soups and stews. Its flavor was strong, but its nutritional value made it extremely important. Herring was another common food source. Large schools of herring could provide vast quantities of fish, helping entire communities prepare for winter. Meat was also available, though it was often consumed more carefully. Cattle, sheep, goats, and pigs provided valuable sources of protein. However, maintaining livestock through winter required significant resources. As a result, some animals were slaughtered during autumn. Their meat could then be preserved using smoking, drying, or salting techniques. Smoked meat became a familiar sight inside many longhouses. Strips of meat hung from rafters, exposed to smoke from the hearth below. This process helped prevent spoilage while adding flavor. Throughout winter, these preserved meats were used sparingly. Families understood the importance of making supplies last. A large feast might be enjoyable, but careful rationing ensured long-term survival. Dairy products also contributed significantly to the Viking diet. Cows, goats, and sheep produced milk during much of the year. Fresh milk did not last long, but it could be transformed into products that remained edible for extended periods. Cheese was particularly valuable. It could be stored through much of the winter and provided important nutrients. Butter was another useful food. In some cases, butter was preserved in containers and kept in cool locations where it remained usable for months. These dairy products added variety to winter meals and helped supplement other food sources. Vegetables were less abundant during winter, but they were not entirely absent. Certain crops stored well after harvest. Turnips, onions, cabbage, and similar vegetables could remain edible for extended periods when stored properly. Families often kept them in cool storage areas where they were protected from freezing temperatures. When added to soups and stews, these vegetables provided flavor and nutrition. Wild foods gathered during warmer seasons also remained important. Berries collected from forests could sometimes be dried or preserved. Nuts provided valuable fats and energy. Certain herbs added flavor to meals and occasionally served medicinal purposes. Nothing useful was wasted. The Viking approach to food reflected a deep understanding of their environment. Resources were limited. Every successful harvest mattered. Every preserved fish counted. Winter demanded efficiency and careful planning. Meals themselves were often simple. A typical winter dinner might consist of stew made from preserved meat, vegetables, and grains. A piece of bread could accompany the meal. Perhaps some cheese would be shared among family members. The food was not extravagant, but it fulfilled its purpose. It provided nourishment, it provided warmth, and perhaps most importantly, it brought people together. The evening meal often became a moment of comfort after a long day. Family members gathered near the hearth. Stories were exchanged. Work paused briefly. The simple act of sharing food reinforced bonds between relatives and neighbors. Yet despite careful preparation, food supplies always remained a source of concern. Winter could be unpredictable. A season lasting longer than expected might place pressure on stored resources. Poor harvests from the previous year could create shortages. Families constantly monitored their supplies and adjusted consumption when necessary. This awareness shaped daily life. People understood that survival depended not only on having food but on managing it wisely. The Vikings were skilled planners. They knew how to preserve resources and avoid unnecessary waste. Their knowledge, accumulated over generations, allowed communities to endure conditions that might seem overwhelming to outsiders. As another winter evening settles over the Scandinavian landscape, the scent of a simmering stew drifts through the longhouse. The hearth glows warmly. Family members gather together. Outside, snow continues to fall softly in the darkness. Inside, a carefully prepared meal offers comfort against the cold. And thanks to months of preparation, the household has enough food to continue facing the long winter ahead. In the next part of our journey, we will explore the remarkable methods Vikings used to store and preserve food, ensuring that precious supplies remained available throughout the harsh months of winter.